Napoleon had beaten Austria, crushed Prussia, humbled Russia, and turned most of Europe into a map that looked suspiciously French. By the time he met Tsar Alexander on a raft after Friedland, he was not just another ruler. He was the man every king had to calculate around. This video was made possible by Honey. Install it for free using the link below and start saving money when you shop online. After the Third and Fourth Coalition Wars, Napoleon's three main continental enemies had been decisively defeated. Austria had been beaten. Prussia had been carved up. Russia had been forced to negotiate. On land, no major power seemed able to stop him. After the Battle of Friedland, Napoleon and Tsar Alexander met on a raft in the middle of a river to discuss peace. They had just spent years fighting each other, but when they met, something strange happened. They got along. They talked, laughed, stayed up late, and developed a surprising mutual respect. Napoleon was so impressed that he later told his wife that if Alexander were a woman, he would make him his mistress. A weird thing to say to your wife, but very Napoleon. The agreement between France and Russia was surprisingly gentle. Russia lost almost no land. In exchange, Russia would join Napoleon against Britain and invade Sweden. Prussia was not treated nearly as kindly. King Frederick William III was pushed aside, and Prussia lost huge amounts of territory to French client states. Napoleon had reshaped Europe again. Only Britain remained as the major enemy still standing. Britain was a problem Napoleon could not solve with his usual method. He could not simply march an army at London. The English Channel protected Britain, and the Royal Navy made invasion almost impossible. Britain also kept funding Napoleon's enemies and using its navy to damage French trade and overseas colonies. So Napoleon tried a different weapon: money. In 1806, he announced the Continental System. This was a massive economic blockade meant to shut Britain out of European trade. No country under Napoleon's influence was supposed to trade with Britain. If he could not invade Britain, he would try to choke its economy. The British economy did suffer. But Britain did what Britain often did. It used its navy, expanded trade elsewhere, and kept going. The real pain often fell on continental Europe. Many countries depended on trade with Britain. Now they were being told to cut off a major trading partner, even though Britain controlled the seas and had a growing global empire. Neutral countries were trapped between two giants. Britain demanded they stop trading with France. Napoleon demanded they stop trading with Britain. Refuse either one, and there could be consequences. And speaking of saving money in difficult times, let's talk about Honey. Shopping in stores means standing up, walking around, and pretending you know where anything is. Terrible. Honey is a free browser extension that searches for promo codes and applies the best one it can find at checkout. You click the button Honey checks for savings, and maybe suddenly your cart hurts a little less. It is free, easy to add, and has already found oversimplified viewers hundreds of thousands of dollars in savings. Click the link below, joinhoney.com/oversimplify, and get Honey for free in 2 easy clicks. Now back to blockade, Britain and a continent being squeezed. Denmark, tired of being attacked and pressured, eventually sided with France. But Napoleon's blockade still had a huge weakness. It only worked if everyone actually obeyed it. Many countries did not. Portugal, a traditional British ally, refused to join the Continental System. Napoleon responded by sending an army to invade. But Portugal was not the only problem. Spain, supposedly Napoleon's ally, was also unreliable. Since losing its fleet at Trafalgar, Spain had been trying to avoid being dragged deeper into Napoleon's plans. Napoleon suspected that Spain was not properly enforcing the blockade. He also thought the Spanish royal family was a disaster. And honestly, he had reasons. King Charles IV seemed weak and distracted. Real power was held by an ambitious favorite who disliked Napoleon. The king's son, Ferdinand, plotted against his own father and eventually overthrew him. The royal family was a mess of rivalry, jealousy, incompetence, and embarrassment. French troops had already entered Spain on their way to Portugal. Then they occupied Spanish forts. Napoleon invited the Spanish royals to France, supposedly to mediate their dispute. But the mediation ended with Napoleon removing them all. Charles was not king. Ferdinand was not king. Napoleon placed his own brother on the Spanish throne. For all practical purposes, Spain became a French puppet. Napoleon expected many Spaniards to be pleased. Their royal family was unpopular, after all. But he badly misread the situation. People do not usually enjoy being controlled by a foreign power, and in Spain, Catholic feeling ran deep. Napoleon's earlier attacks on the church made French rule even more hated. So Spain exploded. The Spanish people revolted. Armed bands ambushed French troops across the country. Atrocities were committed on both sides. The French now had to fight regular Spanish forces, Portuguese forces, British troops, and countless guerrilla fighters spread throughout the countryside. Britain seized the opportunity and landed an army led by the future Duke of Wellington. Now, British troops were beating French troops on land. Napoleon personally went to Spain and pushed the Allied armies back. But he could not stay. His empire had too many problems, and soon his attention was needed elsewhere. Spain became a nightmare. Napoleon was brilliant at traditional warfare, armies, battles, maneuvers, decisive blows. But Spain was different. It was occupation insurgency, ambushes, villages, mountains, anger, religion, revenge, and endless resistance. It became something like Napoleon's Vietnam. Hundreds of thousands of French troops and massive resources were tied down there for years. Napoleon could win battles, but he could not break the will of the Spanish people. And while France bled in Spain, Europe watched. Austria saw an opening. Austria had already been beaten by Napoleon several times. But with Napoleon trapped in Spain and Britain offering money, Emperor Francis decided to try again. The War of the Fifth Coalition began. Did Austria win? No, Napoleon defeated them in about 4 months. But this time it was not easy. The Austrians had been studying him. They had reformed their army. Napoleon, meanwhile, was increasingly relying on young and inexperienced conscripts after years of war. The fighting was bloody. Napoleon even suffered his first major battlefield defeat. When he finally beat Austria at the Battle of Wagram, the victory was costly. Still, Napoleon won again. Austria lost more territory. But soon after, Napoleon and Emperor Francis made a very different kind of agreement. Napoleon would marry Francis's young daughter. That created an obvious problem. Napoleon already had a wife. Napoleon and Josephine had become fond of each other over the years, but now Napoleon was playing the dynasty game. He wanted a male heir, and Josephine had not given him one. So he divorced her and married into one of Europe's oldest royal houses. At least nobody got beheaded. For Austria, the marriage made sense. If Napoleon was going to keep winning, maybe it was better to be connected to him than crushed by him. For Napoleon, the marriage brought legitimacy, alliance, and eventually a son. On the surface, his empire still looked magnificent, but cracks were appearing. The blockade against Britain was not working properly. Spain was consuming men and money. The victory over Austria had been expensive. Napoleon was still powerful, but the old feeling that he could not be beaten was weakening. Even Sweden entered Napoleon's orbit. After being defeated by Russia, Sweden overthrew its king. Through a strange chain of events, one of Napoleon's own marshals, Bernadotte, became Crown Prince of Sweden under the name Karl Johann. Sweden joined the Continental System and, for a time, stood with France. Napoleon still seemed to dominate Europe. All he needed to do was avoid one enormous mistake. Unfortunately, the enormous mistake was coming. France's alliance with Russia could have been terrifyingly powerful. Together, Napoleon and Alexander might have controlled Europe. But the alliance did not last. Russia felt it was not getting enough out of the arrangement. Napoleon's Duchy of Warsaw sat right on Russia's doorstep and looked like a threat. Worse, the Continental System was damaging Russia's economy. Russian trade suffered, and pressure grew to reopen commerce. Eventually, Russia began trading with Britain again. Napoleon was furious. His whole system depended on blocking Britain. If Russia ignored the blockade, then the system collapsed. And if the system collapsed, Britain remained strong. Napoleon believed the security of his empire depended on forcing Russia back into line. So in 1812, he went to war. He gathered the largest army Europe had ever seen, drawing troops from across his empire and allied states. This vast force, the Grande Armée, marched east into Russia. Napoleon wanted what he always wanted, a quick, decisive battle. But Russia had a different plan. They retreated. Napoleon's tactics depended on speed. He liked to move fast, outmaneuver the enemy force, battle, and destroy them. But if the enemy kept retreating while burning crops and supplies, Napoleon's army could not live off the land. If it could not live off the land, it needed supply trains. If it needed supply trains, it moved slower. If it moved slower, Napoleon could not fight the kind of war he wanted. That was the Russian strategy. Scorched earth. Napoleon chased them deeper and deeper into hostile territory. His army suffered through a brutally hot summer. Men died from exhaustion, disease, and heat. Supplies ran low, Hunger spread, desertion increased. Still, the Russians kept retreating. Napoleon thought about turning back several times, but he kept believing that one more push would bring the decisive battle. He nearly caught the Russians at Smolensk, but he did not secure the total victory he needed. Finally, near Moscow, the Russians turned and fought at Borodino. It became the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars. The Russian army fought fiercely. Napoleon's tactics were less elegant than in his younger days. Instead of brilliant maneuver, the battle became a massive frontal pounding against Russian defenses. The casualties were enormous. In the end, the Russians retreated, leaving the road to Moscow open. Napoleon entered the city. In his mind, this should have meant victory. He had defeated the Russian army and taken the historic heart of Russia. Surely Tsar Alexander would now negotiate. But Moscow burned. The city went up in flame, leaving Napoleon without the shelter and supplies his exhausted army needed. He sent messages to Alexander, expecting surrender or peace terms. Alexander did not answer. He waited. Winter was coming. Napoleon's army was deep inside Russia, hundreds of miles from safety, with supplies running out. If the Russians refused to negotiate, the French would have to leave. After waiting about a month, Napoleon finally understood the disaster forming around him. The first snow began to fall. He ordered retreat. Then the cold arrived. Not ordinary cold, deadly cold. Men froze to death, horses died, starvation and disease spread. Wounded soldiers were abandoned on the road because carrying them slowed everyone down. Russian Cossacks stalked the shattered army and struck whenever they saw weakness. Napoleon even carried poison around his neck, fearing capture. At the Berezina River, Russian forces nearly trapped him. Napoleon used one last clever maneuver, misleading the Russians into thinking he would cross farther south. Then his engineers built pontoon bridges farther north, and the army began to escape. But when the Russians realized what was happening, chaos followed. The French burned the bridges before everyone crossed. Hundreds drowned, thousands were captured. At this point, Napoleon heard that plots were forming in Paris, so he abandoned the army and returned to France. What remained of the Grande Armée staggered out of Russia. More than 600,000 men had gone in. Fewer than 100,000 returned. Napoleon's power had been shaken like never before. Europe smelled blood. Prussia broke its alliance with France and switched sides. Austria declared neutrality at first. Sweden, led by Napoleon's old marshal, Bernadotte, joined the Allies, partly because Napoleon had earlier invaded Swedish Pomerania. Britain increased financial support to the coalition. The War of the Sixth Coalition began. The Allied armies were stronger now. They had reformed, they had learned. They were better prepared than before. They advanced through Poland and into Germany. Napoleon rushed to build a new army. He called up more than 100,000 new conscripts, many of them teenagers. French factories worked to produce rifles, cannons, and supplies. But one thing could not be replaced so easily: horses. Napoleon's style depended on speed, maneuver, scouting, and pursuit. Without enough cavalry, even when he won battles, he could not chase down and destroy the enemy. In 1813, he took the fight to the Allies and still managed to defeat them. Even with an army full of inexperienced conscripts, Napoleon remained dangerous. But without cavalry, victories were incomplete. The Allies paused and offered a truce. Austria tried to mediate and demanded major concessions from Napoleon. Napoleon refused. Austria then joined the coalition. Now the great powers were together again, and this time they had a plan. Do not fight Napoleon directly when he is in command. If he advances, retreat. Let other Allied armies attack his marshals and his flanks. Avoid the master. Beat everyone around him. It worked. The Allies won a series of victories and forced Napoleon back toward Leipzig. There, the armies of Europe converged. The Battle of Leipzig became the biggest and bloodiest battle of the Napoleonic Wars. Almost 500,000 soldiers from more than a dozen nations fought across the battlefield. Austrians, Prussians, Russians, Swedes, and others pressed the French from multiple sides. For 4 days, the fighting raged. The French fought hard, but the coalition was too large and too coordinated. In the middle of the battle, Saxon troops allied with Napoleon decided the French were losing and switched sides. When defeat became unavoidable, Napoleon ordered a retreat across the only bridge over the river. Then disaster struck. The bridge was blown too early. Around 30,000 French troops were trapped and captured. Leipzig broke Napoleon's control of Germany. After that, the dominoes fell quickly. In Spain, Wellington had been pushing French forces back for years and was now crossing into France. Austrian armies advanced into Italy. Murat, Napoleon's flamboyant cavalry commander, whom he had made King of Naples, switched sides. German states turned against France. The Confederation of the Rhine collapsed. The Netherlands were liberated. Denmark was forced into the coalition. Napoleon's empire was coming apart. But Napoleon was still Napoleon. He prepared to keep fighting. As opinion in Paris turned against him, and France grew exhausted, he called up more conscripts. The Allies, meanwhile, were not fully united on what they wanted. Some peace offers might have allowed Napoleon to remain in power, but Britain kept funding the war, and eventually the coalition agreed on its final goal. Napoleon had to be removed. In 1814, Napoleon launched one of his most famous campaigns to defend France itself. He was massively outnumbered, but the Allied armies were spread out. His smaller army could move quickly, and he used that speed brilliantly. During the 6 Days campaign against Prussian General Blücher, Napoleon struck from multiple directions, winning 4 victories and inflicting far more losses than he suffered. Even with his empire collapsing, he remained a genius on the battlefield. Then he turned south and won more victories against Schwarzenberg's army of Bohemia. But his problem was simple. He could not be everywhere. Where Napoleon was present, the Allies suffered. Where Napoleon was absent, they advanced. Paris was in chaos. The people were sick of war. An ambitious politician secretly encouraged the Allies to enter the city. They did. Paris surrendered. When the Allied leaders entered, many people cheered them as bringers of peace. Napoleon wanted to retake the capital, but his marshals had reached their limit. They understood what he refused to accept. The war was over. For the good of France, he had to abdicate. Without the support of the army, Napoleon had no choice. He hoped his son could inherit the throne. Instead, the old Bourbon monarchy was restored. Louis XVIII, brother of the executed Louis XVI, became king. It was almost as if the French Revolution had never happened. Now the Allies had to decide what to do with Napoleon. They could not let him remain in France. He was too dangerous, too popular with soldiers, and too likely to reignite war. So they sent him to Elba, a small island off the coast of Italy. He even kept the title Emperor of Elba. The arrangement was surprisingly generous. His family received titles. He was supposed to receive a pension from France. He could rule the island and receive visitors. On Elba, he improved infrastructure and introduced legal and social reforms. But life there was not enough. He learned of Josephine's death and was deeply saddened. He was forbidden from seeing his son and his current wife. His pension was not properly paid. He feared assassination. Rumors spread that the Allies might move him somewhere even more remote, and above all, he bored. Napoleon had once ruled Europe. Now he ruled a small island. So he left. His escape from Elba was not exactly a secret midnight adventure. He held something like a departure ceremony, boarded a ship and sailed back to France with about 1,000 men. In France, Louis XVIII was king. At first, many people had accepted him because Napoleon's last years had brought war death and economic suffering. But the Bourbon monarchy soon began to look like a return to the old world. Nobles wanted privileges back. The king's court seemed detached from the people. Napoleon believed France might welcome him. The reaction was mixed, but many soldiers were thrilled. The king sent troops to arrest him. Many of those troops were Napoleon's old soldiers, unhappy under Bourbon reforms. Instead of arresting him, they joined him. Napoleon marched to Paris. Louis XVIII fled. Napoleon reclaimed the throne without serious resistance. The emperor was back. The Allied monarchs were horrified. Napoleon promised peace. He said he would behave, but no one believed him. They declared him an outlaw and the illegitimate ruler of France. They did not declare war on France. They declared war on Napoleon personally. That is how you know you have become a serious problem. The Allies prepared to invade again. The nearest threat was in Belgium, where British and Prussian armies were positioned. Together, they outnumbered Napoleon. So he returned to an old strategy: divide them and defeat them separately. He marched north with about 125,000 men. At first, he had success. He beat the Prussians and turned toward the British. But confusion and hesitation among his marshals allowed both enemy armies to retreat. Crucially, the Prussians did not run far away to the east. They moved north, staying close enough to help the British. Napoleon sent forces to hold them off while he moved against Wellington, who had taken a defensive position at Waterloo. Blücher promised Wellington that the Prussians would come if the British could hold long enough. Napoleon needed to defeat Wellington before the Prussians arrived in strength. The battle was close. Wellington held the high ground and key defensive positions, including strong buildings across the battlefield. Napoleon waited for the ground to dry, losing time he did not really have. Then French troops attacked Hougoumont Farm, but the British-German defenders held. Marshal Ney launched major cavalry charges against the British line. The British formed infantry squares, and the French cavalry suffered badly. The French captured a farmhouse in front of the British line and used artillery to hammer the enemy. Napoleon then sent in the Imperial Guard, his elite troops, to break Wellington's army. Wellington's line was near the limit, but the Prussians had begun arriving. Then more arrived. When the British held and the Imperial Guard was thrown back, panic spread through the French army. The soldiers feared encirclement. The line collapsed. Waterloo was an Allied victory. Napoleon's final chance was gone. He surrendered to the British, apparently hoping for a quiet life near London. The British had no interest in that. This time they would not send him to a nearby island. They sent him to Saint Helena, a remote island in the Atlantic Ocean, far from Europe, and almost impossible to escape. Napoleon spent the last years of his life in isolation. His house was a wooden bungalow, nothing like the palaces he had known. British officers called him general instead of emperor. His mail was censored. Visitors were controlled. Around 2,000 British soldiers guarded the island, while ships watched the coast. He had once been the most powerful man in Europe. Now he was a prisoner in the middle of the ocean. On Saint Helena, Napoleon fought one final battle, the battle for memory. He wrote and dictated his memoirs. He defended his actions. He shaped his legend. He presented himself not just as a conqueror, but as a man of destiny, a product of the revolution, a builder of laws, a victim of jealous monarchs, and the greatest soldier of his age. In that battle, he succeeded. After Napoleon's defeat, Europe's monarchs tried to restore the old balance, but they could not fully erase what had happened. The French Revolution and Napoleon's armies had spread new ideas across the continent. Monarchs returned, but absolute control was harder to rebuild. France restored the Bourbons, but more revolutions would follow. In Germany and Italy, resistance to Napoleon and reaction to his rule helped push forward modern nationalism. His Napoleonic code remained the basis of law in several modern countries. His military legacy was enormous. Statistically, he is often considered one of the greatest generals in history. His campaigns changed warfare. He was one of the last great leaders to command armies in battle, while also ruling a vast empire. And yet, Napoleon remains difficult to define. Was he the defender of the French Revolution, spreading equality and merit? Or did he betray it by crowning himself emperor and restricting liberties? Was he a ruthless conqueror trying to dominate Europe? Or was he defending France against monarchies determined to destroy his power? The debate continues. Napoleon died at age 51, officially of stomach cancer, though some have suspected poison. The British buried him inside multiple coffins, as if they wanted to make absolutely sure he stayed put this time. In 1840, his remains were moved to Paris. Today they rest beneath the dome of Les Invalides. Napoleon began as a boy from a minor Corsican family. He rose through revolution, war, ambition, brilliance, ruthlessness, luck, and sheer force of will. He made kings fear him, armies follow him, and Europe reorganize itself around him. He once said, "There is no immortality except the memory left in the minds of men." By that measure, Napoleon got exactly what he wanted. And yes, he was definitely average height for his time.